Hello. This week we move away from the strong emotions, monsters, mad scientists, and the sublime, at least until our next Dracula assignment, to the literary movement called Realism. Many famous 19th century authors wrote in this genre, including Charles Dickens from England, Gustave Flaubert from France, Henrik Ibsen from Norway, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky from Russia, and our featured authors for this week, Herman Melville from the US on the left, and Guy de Maupassant from France on the right. Realist authors wrote in all genres, from plays to short stories to big fat Victorian novels. This genre was also extremely influential on film, largely because early filmmakers often used these works to create adaptations. Some would argue that realism is still the dominant genre today, although fantasy and sci-fi may be giving it a run for its money. Like all good literary movements, realism is a reaction against what came before it, in this case, Romanticism. As you'll recall, Romanticism elevated the emotions, nature, and heroic causes over the rationalism and empiricism of the Enlightenment. Far from venerated, scientists are often depicted as crazed zealots who pursue knowledge at the cost of basic humanity. I'm looking at you, Dr. Frankenstein and Aylmer from The Birthmark. The Gothic aesthetic, a subgenre of Romanticism, continues to be popular to this day, never completely losing ground once Horace Walpole introduced it with the Castle of Otranto in 1764. But tastes eventually change, and the latter part of the 19th century saw another sea change in literary and artistic aesthetics. Writers left behind the sublime vistas of nature and went to the city, and they left behind the vaulted idealism of the Romantics and instead aimed for an art that was closer to life. Thus, realism was born as a literary genre. As you might guess from a movement that developed as a reaction against Romanticism, realism rejected the exotic settings, idealism, and fantastical plot twists of those earlier works in favor of local color. By this I mean accents in dialogue and detailed descriptions, and a faithful representation, also known as verisimilitude. I put this in quotes because it's still fiction. Some would argue that realism is more of a technique than a literary movement in its depiction of dialogue and subject matter. Works of literary realism emphasize characterization above all other features, like plot or theme, and realist authors often depict middle-class or lower-class subjects over the noble or fanciful characters in romantic works, and they aim for psychological realism. This may mean that, quote, complex ethical choices are often the subject, close quote. You will definitely see the issue of complex ethical choices in both of our readings for this week, Bartleby the Scrivener and the Jewelry. Some of the basic techniques and choices of subject matter evident in realism may be linked to a returned interest in empiricism and inductive reasoning. By this I mean coming at truths about human nature by examining many human subjects, in this case characters, closely. This may be why many big fat Victorian novels have a full host of characters of varying social orders. The venerable literary scholar of 19th century literature, Ian Watt, has suggested that modern realism begins from the position that truth can be discovered by the individual through his senses. Realism was not a new thing by any means. We see works that portray characters with great psychological realism from very old authors like Shakespeare and Chaucer, whom you may have read in World Lit I. Of course, if you are a contrarian or just curious, you might wonder what makes a realist work realistic. Many realistic writers themselves recognize that realism was problematic and even impossible to achieve. After all, they are not reporting everything that happens to particular characters, but curating what the reader learns about these fictional characters and their worlds. And of course, the characters themselves are entirely the product of their authors' imaginations. However, we will leave any metaphysical arguments aside here, as the purpose of this lecture is just to give you a broad overview of the literary movement and not to tie your brain into a knot. The time boundaries of realism are a bit squishy and differ when you're talking about European realism versus American realism. For European realism, realism did not really gain a foothold until the 1830s, although some authors, like Jane Austen, had exhibited realist tendencies in the midst of the Romantic movement. At some point, realism fades into naturalism, which we'll discuss in a later lecture. American realism is usually marked from the Civil War to the end of the century. We see realism in art as well as literature. But the growing availability of photography, the ultimate realist medium, begins to turn art to more abstract avenues, beginning with Impressionism, as you see here. The thought being, if photography can more realistically depict reality, then maybe art should try doing something different. We've been reading short stories for the past few weeks, so I believe it's time we discuss the short story as a genre. There is some dispute as to the beginnings of this genre. After all, there are some very old examples of short stories in Aesop's fables, The Thousand and One Nights, and medieval romances. But in the 19th century, where we've been camped for the last few weeks, authors like our friend Edgar Allan Poe began to write critically about the genre and ushered in a revolution in short story narration. You can see this new style of narration on full display in works such as The Cask of Amontillado by Poe and The Jewelry by Guy de Maupassant. Here are some features of the short story, according to Richard Lisi. First off, it's written in prose as opposed to poetry, using direct forms of language. This is not to say that there are not metaphors and other literary elements in short stories. There are a limited number of characters in short stories, mainly due to space. There is a type of unity of effect, meaning that the plot is not necessary for a short story. Sometimes mood is more emphasized. And just like there's a limited number of characters, in short stories there is a limited setting. A few more characteristics of short stories taken from the Bedford Glossary of Literary and Critical Terms. There's a single focus, meaning a single plot, no subplots. Short stories are meant to reveal essential aspects of character or characters, not to show character development over time. After all, there's not room in a short story for character development over time. There is usually some kind of dramatic revelation or effect near the end of the story. You'll certainly see this in the works that we read this week, but also in the works that you read last week. And short stories can be from any genre: horror, sci-fi, everyday fiction, etc. Although short stories don't always focus on plots, the ones that you'll read this week certainly have a plot. If it's been a while since you studied the parts of a plot, exposition, rising action, etc., then please do the short reading for the Norton Introduction to Literature about the parts of the plot.